morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to today's episode. Today, a fantastic topic, a topic that basically affects every single individual on planet Earth. So we'll be talking about privacy with none other than Debbie Reynolds, the Data Diva.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be on the show and happy to collaborate with you again.
Very nice. Would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. So, as you said, I'm Debbie Reynolds. People call me the Data Diva. I'm the CEO, founder, and Chief Data Privacy Officer of Debbie Reynolds Consulting. So, I work at the intersection of law, privacy, and technology, and I help companies make privacy a business advantage as opposed to something that they do grudgingly.
Before we hop into the details of the nuances of it, let's just first talk a bit about, are there any differences? And if there are, what are the difference between data privacy, consumer privacy, and privacy as human right?
Yeah, okay. That's a good question. So, privacy in and of itself really is about a person's right and how those rights are articulated within the areas or the countries that they're looking at. Two major schools of thought, actually, there are three, but I'll talk about two in particular. One is privacy as a human right, which is what we see in the EU, which means that from cradle to grave, you have a right that cannot be, taken away, can't be sold, can't be traded, right? And so a lot of the laws within in the EU over the decades that this has been established in your constitution has tried to codify that into laws. So the most popular that we talk about is the GDPR, obviously, because it's had such a big influence around the world. But then also there are privacy laws like we have in the US, which are more consumer based. So it means that these rights kick in when you're consuming something. So you're
Mhm.
buying something, like you sign up for an account or something, and then there are rights to protect that. So the difference between a human and consumer right is that uh, a human right is more covers more things, right, than a consumer right. So I'll give you an example. Let's say in the U.S., if you go to a grocery store and you purchase stuff and they have your data, they have an obligation because you're a consumer to protect your data in certain ways. So there are laws in different states and they're different, right? To tell you, what a company has, what obligation they have to a person that's consuming something. So let's say you go across the street to a church in the US. And let's say you sign up for stuff like a newsletter and different things with the church. The church, like for example, in the state of California, they they don't have an obligation to handle your data in the same way. So that's a really
Mhm.
big difference, I think, between the EU and the US, where our a lot of our rights or a lot of the laws that you're seeing being passed are based on consumerism and not on you being a human and wanting to protect your rights.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's also one of the reasons I asked this question, is because to me, privacy is always a human right. And to Europeans in general, privacy is always a human right. And I think in the conversations that we had before, we talked about these nuances between the understanding of privacy as human right in different countries and culture, and how it's perceived and how it's understood. Because so it was like very interesting to understand this different perspective and understanding of how some organizations are thinking of privacy mostly from a consumer perspective but not as a human rights perspective. So where do you see the biggest challenge with that? I mean, obviously one of the challenges being that yes, human right to privacy is not always protected through this, but what are the other challenges that you're seeing with this?
I think the understanding or the challenges is as the different privacy regimes are put in place in different countries, knowing, as you said, the nuances and the differences, because it's not the same. So, in the EU, because privacy is a fundamental human right in your constitution since the 50s, these laws that you are passing are protecting the privacy right that you have. Where in the US, the laws we're making, we're trying to have privacy rights and protect it at the same time. So that's very
Right.
different.
Right. And one of the things that I also like is a heated topic and point of topic of discussion always is privacy versus security, right? I mean,
Right.
I've worked with security and privacy in my career, and to tell people, you know what, they're not the same thing. Please, you have to really understand there's a difference. However, at the same time they do overlap, right? They're definitely like interacting and converging parts of both security and privacy. So could you say something about the biggest conflicts that you see or have experienced in the way people don't understand the difference, but also where is the possibility and where is the importance of collaboration and mutual how do you say complementing each other?
Yeah. It's hard because there are lots of misunderstandings about cybersecurity. I think just technology in general. So, like if you do any job in technology, I feel like people think you do everything, right? So they think you do hardware, you do software, you do pen testing, you do all this other type of stuff, and that's not true. So what I try to do, I try to equate it to like being a doctor. So doctors can have many different specialties. So when someone says they're a doctor, are they a doctor of education? Are they a doctor of medicine? If they're a doctor of medicine, are they a brain surgeon? Are they a podiatrist? You just don't know, right? So cybersecurity is that way, where people have their different forms and functions and specialties in that. So people, that's one thing that people don't understand. But about privacy, the way that I explain privacy and cybersecurity, the way that I think it makes most sense is I describe it as a bank. So think about the security at a bank. So the bank, they're securing the outside, the inside, and everything that's happening inside. So like, the tellers log in and all the other type of stuff.
Hmm.
So cybersecurity is responsible for the security of everything that happens within the organization, right? And privacy is about what's in the vault and why is it in there. So why are you protecting this data differently and why is it in there? So cyber isn't as granular. So the cyber responsibility to protect everything. And obviously if something in the vault is like more valuable, right? Than the other things in the organization, it gets like a higher level of security. But cybersecurity, you're going to protect whatever is in the vault, regardless of what's in there. Where privacy, we're going to say, you know, this is in here because of X, and this is why we need to treat it differently. So it's like a more granular way to talk about particular things within the organization and not everything.
Hmm. And somehow still privacy and cybersecurity need to collaborate, right? And they can mutually complement each other in certain areas. Where do you see are the biggest potentials for collaboration and complementing?
I think the biggest ways that they can complement one another is that privacy should impact the whole organization, right? It should be a culture of cyber security and a culture of privacy. So everyone has a part to play. And in a
Mm-hmm.
way, people, it makes it seem so generic. So almost like if you don't give people a specific role, then they don't know what they're supposed to do. So if you say it's everybody's responsibility, but then you aren't, specific about what that means, I think that's problematic. But I think the really important thing about cybersecurity and privacy is that they do work together. They have a symbiotic relationship. So being able to collaborate together is really important, and really breaking down those silos is very important. So where in previous over the years I've seen, we have people who the technical people are in a silo and the legal people are in a silo, and this is
Mm-hmm.
something, in order to have privacy and security work together, they have to break down those walls and they have to meet with each other and talk with each other, make sure they understand one another, because they're all professionals in their own right, in their own area of expertise, but they have to really join together to be able to create something that's of value to the business.
Right, absolutely. So the key really is both communication and culture, basically around it, that would help have a better collaboration between the two areas. Absolutely.
Right.
So let's talk a bit about what's happening, because obviously Shrems 1 came, Shrems 2 came, I mean GDPR came before that. Even before GDPR, obviously there has been privacy as a human right there, as I said, over decades. It's not something new. GDPR just obviously made all these formality and legalization around consent and what do you need the data for what purpose it's being used, and so on. With all the changes that's happening, and then we've had Cambridge Analytica, we've had cases where we still see that major companies, big companies, do not value, or they value consumers' data for their own purpose, right? Without really taking into account the human privacy aspect, the data privacy aspect, the how much data do they need, why do they need it, right? Before they're actually just gathering and collecting all the data for purposes of selling or their business model, whatever that is. Where do you see still is a big need for change going forward? Where are we still struggling the most despite that?
Good question. Let's see. First of all, people understanding that these laws may apply to them. Like I see some smaller companies say, well, that's for, the big companies. That's for Google and Facebook, and it doesn't apply to me, which is not true.
Mm-hmm.
But then the flip side of that is that it can be very overwhelming, like all the different regulations and stuff like that. So then realizing that not every single thing in the regulation is going to apply to you. So so don't get so upset about it or don't feel overwhelmed, because you just have to look at your business and the data that you're handling and then pick out the things that apply to you. So then you don't feel like, oh my God, I have these 99 extra things I have to do, which is not true. Not every company, there are things that you probably are doing in your company that may not apply. So I'll give you an example. Like I have a client in the UK, and they're a membership organization. They have in all these different countries around the world and stuff like that. And because this particular company is a non-for-profit organization, the CCPA, which is California Privacy Act, does not apply to them because it does not apply to nonprofit organizations. So they were really concerned. 'Cause they were like, "Oh my God, this law comes out. Oh, it's gonna apply to me." I'm like, "No, no, that doesn't apply to you. So you don't even have to think about it." So that, and then another one that comes up, like certain businesses. Let's say you don't do anything with children. So if you don't have any business at all, or you don't have any consumers that are under a certain age, then you don't have to worry about those. The laws or the parts of that laws have to do with children. So just don't think about that. So
Mm-hmm.
part of it is just right sizing it for your company and figuring out what applies to you, and then minimizing your data. Really think about why you're capturing the data in the first place. And if you can't think of a good reason, then you should not be capturing it.
Yeah, right. Coming back to the purpose of why you're collecting the data in the first place. Absolutely. So let's talk a bit about how the technologies have been changing, right? I mean, we talked about a bit about the cases that have happened, and still a lot of companies are not understanding data privacy and consumer privacy to the extent that they should. Add to that the complexity of technology, and we are seeing obviously ethical risks, we are seeing biases, we are seeing discrimination, we are seeing what's happening in the software and the systems and the codings and all these things, which lead to obviously additional privacy issues. What do you see is the biggest, let's say, the biggest things that one needs to work on this? How do we actually make sure that we're able to consume technology going forward while not making it a big hinder, or not even a big, but just like a setback for privacy in that sense?
Yeah. Well, privacy by design is very important. It's a great concept to think about it as you're developing tools, as opposed to, let's develop this cool tool and then let's figure out what we're going to do about privacy. It doesn't really work that way, especially if your system is supposed to ingest or interact with data of people, right? So people own their own data, in my opinion, right? And the companies that use their data, they're like a steward, a data steward. So the data is on loan to you, and you have a responsibility to handle it in a certain way. So some of the biggest challenges I see have to do with AI
Mm-hmm.
and things like facial recognition and the use of biometrics in technology applications because the harm can be really devastating to an individual if we get it wrong, meaning things like using AI in policing where you're arresting the wrong person, or using AI in evaluations in a way that is discriminating against people, or in schools even. So we're seeing, because of so much distance learning as a result of COVID, some of these softwares that are created to do these education systems are, had an example where they were grading people of color poorly because the camera could not recognize them. So it made it seem like they weren't they weren't doing their classes, which is not true. So that's like an example
Wow.
of algorithm not working the way that it should work,
Mm-hmm.
because it's supposed to work for everybody, not just for some people. So
Mm-hmm.
part of that is just really, I think there was a leaked manuscript or document about the EU coming up with standards for AI, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is amazing. And I want to see that kind of around the world. Like, there are
Mm-hmm.
people who can look at code and can tell you, like, this is a problem, let's change it here. And instead of it being something that companies, you know, it's a nice to have, I think it should be mandatory, I feel, especially if you're dealing with situations that could cause potential harm to individuals.
Mm-hmm. Well, technology is always used for good and bad. So to
Right.
minimize really the bad impacts of AI, not only by, well, in cybersecurity terms, not only from cyber attackers, but also by our own mistake and fault in the way systems are built, and what are they used for, and how they could have these risks towards both bias discrimination and also just invasion of privacy in general, right?
Oh yeah, totally. Well, part of it, invasion of privacy, I guess, has two parts. So one is you're being observed in a space that you don't want to be observed in, right? And the other is where people want to use a lot of the smart tech, which you're basically inviting surveillance. So,
Mm-hmm.
like smart speakers and all that stuff, smart doorbell, a smart thermostat, they're collecting so much data about you. And I think people really need to understand what it's doing to be able to make a informed decision of whether they want to use those things or not.
There's a part, there's a role that consumers or users have to play here, and we will come to that. But there's also a big role that companies and businesses have to play here, and
Right.
government in general. This is where we also talk about how we cannot have, for example, too much security that invades privacy to an extent that it's conflicting with human right, for example, right? So
Hmm.
what can businesses do here? How should businesses go forward in ensuring that whether it's just the invasion through apps or mass surveillance, what's happening through different technology in that sense.
Yeah. Well, I guess when I think about two types of businesses. So one is uh, technology businesses that are creating these technologies, and then technology businesses that are using these technologies. So for the
Mm-hmm.
creators of the technology, it's important that you do things like privacy by design and give people features. So when people are making these tools, they want to make them so that they can be used with anyone. So they'll put in as many features as they can, and not all those features may be lawful or may be appropriate for your business use. So for a company that purchases a tool that they want to use that has AI, they need to really
Mm-hmm.
look through it and see what it does. And if it's doing something that is unlawful or you don't think is ethical, you have the ability, hopefully, to be able to turn it off and not use those features. So I talk to people a lot about that, where they see it, the thing does 10 things, but maybe, you only need six. So turn off the other four.
Right, right, right. And how about the mass surveillance bit? Because this is
Yeah,
where the big question as well is. Are
yeah,
we being mass surveilled by governments? To what extent is or should be lawful, and what would be considered unlawful?
yeah. That's a tough question. Especially because of COVID, especially because of COVID. So when, let's say before COVID, well, governments have the capability to do all types of surveillance, right? And if surveillance is deemed to be something in the public interest, that's something that they can do, and that can sort of short circuit an individual's right. So as we're seeing with COVID, where a lot of these countries are creating like these health passports and these health checks and tests and stuff like that, because there's a public health crisis, they can sort of take over more of individual rights, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because they're saying, this is something that impacts the whole country. So there's more data going into public domain about individuals as a result of COVID. And so that, the way it's supposed to work is, the government can have these special powers if in an emergency, and then once the emergency is over, they're supposed to give those rights back. But I don't know how that's going to happen. A lot of times when governments take those rights, they never want to give them back. They want to always have it. But I think as a discussion is being had all over, where I've seen documentaries where people are like, "Oh, well, that van is surveilling you," or if you walk past this point, you'll be like recorded, and people have to make a choice. But a lot of times you don't have a choice. It's like, I live in Chicago, and Chicago is one of the most heavily surveilled cities that you can imagine. It has been for over 20 years. But for me, I don't, I do look up and I see like a camera or I see like a listening device or whatever. And it doesn't uh, interrupt what I'm doing in my life. But I think just the idea that everything that you do is being recorded in some way, even your phone. So your phone is surveilling you. So you put a phone in your pocket, it knows that you took 10 steps to the left or 10 steps to the right. It knows, what street you're on and all that type of stuff. And, in the past, before computers, before cell phones, no one cared about that. Like no one was collecting that data. No one cared about that. But now, because there's so much data being collected, people are wondering for what purpose and what
Mm-hmm.
is going to happen with that data in the future.
Right. So I have two follow-up questions on that because this is really interesting what just brought up right now. One, have you seen other challenges that COVID-19 has brought with itself in terms of invasion of privacy? And two, as you say, I mean, we don't have to go too far to the government really mass surveilling us. A lot of it is happening on our phones and mobiles at the end of the day on a daily basis. So, second question would be what can consumers or users really do? What would be your top recommendations? But let's take the COVID-19 first. Other challenges that you've seen.
Yeah. So the other challenges that I've seen in COVID is people think when people think about medical information, they think that their medical information is always protected, right? But medical information typically is protected in a patient provider type of situation. And then if you volunteer that information, it's not protected because people can people may say, well, because you told your information publicly, then you may not have a right to privacy to that because you volunteered that. So there's a debate about that. But there's obviously more, information in the public space about that where we're seeing things like companies saying, you can come back to the office, but only if you have been vaccinated, so that makes it a public issue in some way, or you can't get on the
Mm,
plane unless you've been vaccinated. And we saw that recently, where there was something happening, I think, in some Caribbean island, St. Vincent, I believe, and they were evacuating people. And they said if you hadn't had a vaccine, you can't evacuate. So we're seeing that's kind of crazy, right?
yeah.
So basically, you have to tell people or show them that you've been vaccinated, someone who's not a medical professional, to be able to get on a plane or go different places. So that's very different, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Uh, the thing that consumers can do, obviously, we don't have a lot of control over what happens with COVID and how governments decide they want to give people access or not give them access. But I think, just being aware of all the technology that you use and reading if you can, the privacy policies, I think is really helpful. And then you have to you want to be an informed consumer. You want to be able to say, you know, like I don't want to use a smart light bulb because I don't like what it does, So then you say, okay, I read this and I don't like that, so I'm not gonna. I'm gonna use regular light bulbs, not not these smart, light bulbs or something like that. And for some people, they think it's fine. They're like, okay, I like the advantages that I get to like my vacuum cleaner that runs around the house and I don't have to vacuum. So I'm willing to give up some privacy or willing to, do this because it has a benefit to me. So to me, it's a trade off and people have to decide, what's best for them. But, I think being educated, trying to educate yourself, and it's hard because not everyone is like you, right? Who's really smart about cyber stuff. So I think being able to get educated, and one thing that I started doing, during
Mm.
COVID, our family, because we aren't able to meet and we're all over, we do these Zoom calls, and we're like, oh, how's so and so, and how's this, and I bring up cybersecurity stuff. Like I'm telling people, don't click on links that that you don't, from people you don't know and stuff like that. So I think
Mm.
it's important to tell people like your family members about that stuff as well.
So privacy awareness, very, very
Right.
important.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Last question before we stop today's podcast, because I believe the discussions were amazing. I think I can talk to you about this for another hour. This is so fascinating. It's lovely to talk to you. But let's just maybe wrap up with one last question. How can we make vendors and businesses more accountable for privacy in products or services that they provide?
I think, people should vote with their feet or vote with their money. So if you feel, if you tell a company, hey, I like your product, but I'm concerned about this, and they're not willing to change, you can move to a different product or you can do something differently. So I think what's happening now is that companies are starting to see, especially because of Apple, I think. So Apple, when they start putting these privacy features in their phone OS, is really pushing the industry in that direction where they're actually proving that privacy can be a benefit to your company. So one like Apple announced last summer that they were going to do this Apple iOS 14 update, which will have these privacy features that will let people opt in and give them more visibility. And as a result, I think Apple had the most profitable quarter they ever had last the fourth quarter of 2020. And I think part of that is because people are like, yes, help me protect myself, help me protect my privacy. But it's having an impact on other technology companies now as well, whereas they're
Mm.
saying privacy can be profitable. And that's what companies want.
Right. So privacy as business differentiator.
Right.
Lovely. That's
Hmm.
fantastic. Thank you so much, Debbie, for today's episode. I had lovely, lovely conversations with you.
Yeah, this is great. Well, thank you. I love that the stuff that you're working on in cyber is really important, and education is important. So as I said, people just don't understand cybersecurity at all. So the more that you can do this, the better things will be.
So hope you had fun. Hope the conversation was engaging and educational. I'll be back with more amazing episodes, fantastic guests, and amazing conversations. Take care and stay safe.